We're going to talk about the changes in the ETDM process related to the NEPA assignment and those responsibilities transitioning over to the department. Before we get going, I'm going to start right off initially with a poll. And Ruth, if I can turn it over to you to go ahead and administer this particular poll.
Sure. This question is, how much experience do you have with the ETDM process? Please click on the answer that best describes your experience and share the results. There's a few people, 7%, who have never heard of it. 66% are familiar with the process with limited use. 24% are very familiar, and 3% are experts. So back to you, Pete.
Great. Thanks, Ruth. That's extremely helpful because it lets me know in the coming slides how much time to spend on some of those topics. So the topics that will be covered in this presentation will be an overview of ETDM. I'll give you a few slides on that. We'll talk about a pre-screening event, which you should have gotten some details on in yesterday's face-to-face. We'll talk about some changes in the planning screens and the programming screens that occur within the ETDM process. And we'll talk a little bit about the alternative corridor evaluation, that ACE process in ETDM, and the changes. And then we'll talk about things as we transition and advance into the PD&E studies in our NEPA documents as well. So just thinking about what is ETDM, I think for the most part everybody's familiar with this, but I will give a little bit of overview since we have a couple folks that said never heard of it. So ETDM is the department's implementation of what's called PEL, Planning and Environmental Linkages. It's a way to engage our transportation partners. That could be state and federal agencies, it can be the tribes, it can be the public, to get them involved very early in the process to take a look at a proposed project and its alternatives and have those folks actively comment on the project so that we can understand, the potential issues, the potential things that we need to avoid or minimize impact to. We get a sense of the feasibility of the project, and it helps by working with the state and federal partners and tribal governments and the public to help focus down, what can we really build for this project? Which alternative makes the most sense? Because we're taking a balanced approach and we're engaging folks. When we talk about the agencies that we're engaging, it could be the State Historic Preservation Office. It can be the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, our Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, as well as our federal partners, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Army Corps of Engineers, National Marine Fisheries Service, all of those folks. And that's just some of them. There's many of them that are engaged within this process. And we provide an opportunity. We propose a project, we propose some alternatives, and then they review the information that we provide. They look at the project location, they look at the geometry, and they give us back some detailed information that help the project sponsor, determine whether or not we've got a feasible project, what are the things we need to avoid, what are the focused issues that we would need to focus on as a project moves forward. And we begin building this case of coordination that's documented, that's pulling folks together to support, as we move into our project development environment process. If an issue pops up, this is an opportunity for folks to get together, the right agencies, the right individuals, to talk through what are the potential issues on the project. So we're dealing with things when it's still just pencil on paper, not lines, not actual pen and ink changes. It's a much more flexible process that allows folks to have an impact very early on. We have an ETDM manual that establishes the expectations. It goes through the various components. It establishes review timelines. It establishes participants, the types of products that would be produced. On the right-hand side, we have a memorandum of understanding with all of those various state and federal agencies that are working with us in this process to assign people to participate in this early planning and environmental linkages process, to actively review our proposed projects and give us comments within a prescribed timeline. In many cases, there are companion agency operating agreements and funding agreements that are signed between ourselves and the agency, and today FHWA. And I say today because as we take on NEPA assignment in the future, as these negotiated agreements go forward, it'll just be dual party between us and the agency that are assigning resources versus having FHWA as they would today. And as you know, with all of those various agencies, each one, has a different jurisdiction, has different laws that govern them, different things they manage. The State Historic Preservation Office is looking at historical and archaeological stuff. Army Corps of Engineers is looking at water basins and things like that. You're looking at the wildlife agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service looking at wildlife and habitat issues, National Marine Fisheries Service looking at habitat issues, but from the seacoast. You've got the U.S. Coast Guard looking at our bridges and waterways, looking for navigational issues. So every one of those folks really brings something different to the equation and the evaluation of our projects. And it's all of these various environmental considerations, those same things we would do detailed analysis on within the PD&E and the NEPA study process as we're developing a document and really digging into the project development process for this specific project. All of those agencies are providing us comments back relative to their expertise, and each one of those agencies is mapped to one or more of these various considerations depending on what that agency is and what they're charged with managing or protecting. Within that ETDM process, we facilitate all this coordination through what are called 2 screening events. You've got a planning screen and a programming screen. And at a planning screen, this is a high-level screen. You're looking at qualifying projects, and a qualifying project isn't something small. We're not talking about a repaving. We're not talking about a sidewalk project. You're talking about things that really everybody should come together on and really consider what's out there. For instance, a new road connecting, a new location, a new bridge in an area that hasn't existed before, a new bypass, additional capacity on existing like a CIS facility or something like that. Those are the types of qualifying projects that would go through the ETDM process and go through these screening events. But a planning screen, we're looking at projects that are coming either out of either the MPO or the department, looking for things that are either in the outer years or considered to be coming into the cost feasible plans. And in those cost feasible plans, you've got to have the revenue to show that you have the ability to move that project forward through the project delivery processes. You've got all the funds to actually build it. And so getting folks together and having an opportunity to get feedback from all of our partners, it helps the transportation project sponsor understand, are we talking about a $10 million project, or are you talking about a $100 million project? What are where this project is going? Are there concerns? Are there critical flaws that need to be identified? Are there opportunities where concerns are identified and we can go back and potentially revisit the project as it's being proposed? And at that planning screen, you're really trying to get that assessment of, do I have a good project? Do I need to go back to the board? Will we have enough revenue? How do folks feel about this? So that ultimately you can determine, one, should it remain in your cost feasible, and if it does, should it be prioritized and continue to be moved forward? when it is prioritized, that's when we complete the programming screen. So the programming screen is an annual event where projects that have been prioritized either through the MPO process or through the department, the projects have been identified as these are projects that we would like to continue moving forward into the PD&E and on to later project development phases. And so now this annual event is looking at these proposed projects and any alternatives, and instead of just looking at the potential, all those environmental considerations and whether or not there are any new critical concerns that may have been identified that weren't there previously, because depending on how long it's been between a planning screen and a programming screen, a lot may have changed. What are those new and different changes that have occurred since last time we looked at it? Or it's a new priority project and perhaps it didn't go through a planning screen and it's just starting at a programming screen, so you're involving everybody to take a look at the proposed line work, the proposed project, to get a sense of all those things you need to avoid and minimize impact to, as well as what are all the things that you would need to do to build a scope of service. At a programming screen, we're talking about projects that have been prioritized. They are going to be moving into the PD&E. They will be working towards a NEPA study at some point for projects coming through the NEPA assignment program. And we need to build a scope of service. We need to identify the technical studies. We need to know what coordination's required. Are there permits? What's the level of involvement we're going to have relative to each environmental issue, and what's the level of work that's going to need to occur. So a programming screen helps us work with our partners to help figure that out, to help figure out what's out there, how we're going to address it, whether that's through our own understanding of what's out there and how we're going to address it, or whether that's refined based on information that we're getting from our ETAT as experts out there providing guidance to us. And through these efforts, through this planning and environmental linkage that's occurring through the ETDM process and those screening events in particular, you've got this early agency involvement. It's open, it's transparent, it's documented. Some of the products that go through those screening events, as you begin to put the project information together, you're putting out a purpose and need. That purpose and need is reviewed by the ETAT agencies. The ETAT agencies are those environmental technical advisory team, which collectively, that's the state and federal partners, those folks that signed that memorandum of understanding, those agencies that we have agency operating agreements or funding agreements with. Those folks collectively, as they engage in those planning screens and programming screens, are collectively called the ETAT. And you've got that early involvement with all those folks. They have opportunities to review the project information. They review the purpose and need. They have the ability to respond to the purpose and need. They're helping us build our scope of service, what technical studies, what level of detail, what types of coordination. And ultimately, this information feeds into determining the environmental document class of action. Is this a type 2 based on what we know? Are there questions of significance? Would it be an environmental assessment, or have we identified that there are potentially going to be significant impacts and we would elevate to an EIS? So all of this detailed information during the planning stage becomes available and accessible to help build these projects. Simultaneously, the information is available to the public. And then as we also go through an alternative corridor evaluation process, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, but at a high level, today, when we enter into the PD&E process, into the environmental study phase, we evaluate certainly on the federal side any for EISs, any prudent, feasible alternative that comes forward. An alternative corridor evaluation process allows us to eliminate unreasonable alternatives for reasons other than the alternative not meeting the purpose and need. Right now, today, you can always eliminate an alternative because it does not meet the purpose and need. You can show it was considered, it didn't meet the purpose and need, and eliminate it from detailed evaluation in the environmental phase. However, if you want to eliminate alternatives for other reasons, there's a whole other process you have to follow that involves development of a methodology. The methodology has to be shared and reviewed by partners. The partners have to have an opportunity to comment on it and indicate their understanding. That methodology then also has to be approved by the lead agency. In this case, that responsibility would be coming over to Office of Environmental Management. And once that methodology is approved, then you can go out and apply that methodology. And then the resulting document from that effort is what's called an ACER, an Alternative Corridor Evaluation Report. And that Alternative Corridor Evaluation Report becomes the supporting documentation to eliminate an alternative as being unreasonable, because you went through that process, you have an approved methodology, and then based on the results, some alternatives either met the criteria and thresholds established in the approved methodology, or it did not. And if they did not, then you have this ACER document and this approved methodology to serve as supporting documentation for the elimination of those alternatives. And so those activities occur again through our planning phase, through our ETDM process and those screening events. You all should be very familiar with this slide. I think it was discussed in detail with you guys. We're just going to focus in that top left column for this part of the presentation. And you'll notice in that first box, we talk about the ETDM screenings, we talk about the scope of service, we talk about advanced notification and class of action evaluation, and how all these things lead into project initiation. Right now, according to the legend, it does show it as green, that these are district activities, but I did want to highlight for you guys that really it should be both, because there are activities that occur within those processes, and we're going to spend this session going through them, that traditionally would be activities that occur with FHWA being the lead agency, but instead with OEM taking on those responsibilities, it shifts, so it's a joint responsibility between the district and OEM. So what is the new role of OEM related to the ETDM process? As I said, as it goes through the screening events, there's various activities that happen throughout the events, and I'll talk about some of them. And really, here's the way to think about it. If FHWA was the lead agency during the ETDM screenings, then that role transitions over to OEM as we shift under NEPA assignment. From a district perspective, probably 95% of everything I'm going to talk about, you do the same today as you did last week, as you did a year ago. When you work within what's called the environmental screening tool, that facilitates those screening events, and you kind of move a project through the process and document things as we move along. What the districts do today working within that system, as they send recommendations to FHWA, say for inviting, cooperating, and participating agencies, they go through the same process, but instead of the email showing up in FHWA's inbox, it shows up in OEM's inbox. So for the most part, it's a lot of those activities that were done previously by FHWA, they'll transition over to us. We're talking about things like, an approval of the purpose and need, an approval of the methodology memorandum under ACE, which I just talked about. If there are alternatives that can be eliminated as being unreasonable, that's again an approval that would shift over to the OEM staff. We talked about approving, cooperating, and participating agencies. Ultimately, the environmental class of action for the federal documents, those type 2s, EAs, and EISs, traditionally would go to FHWA. Those will come to OEM instead. And also, FHWA will not be part of the ETDM issue resolution process. Those are project-based decisions. So if and when OEM needs to be involved on any of those, we would be involved. We think the districts can handle most of the stuff. If you run into issues, you have folks, your project delivery coordinators, those primary individuals that you can work through and engage us when needed. Another thing that is a transition is the providing comments and recommendations on proposed projects during screening events. One thing for those that are familiar with the process is, OEM will not be an active commenter within the screening events themselves, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. But we're in this transition period from FHWA's per FHWA request. After October 14th, they didn't want anything to flow to them that could not be completed and approved by November 30th. Screening events last at least 45 days. If an ETAT agency participant requests an additional 15 days, that puts us out at 60 days. So right now we're not sending any new screening events where FHWA would be the lead. But let me tell you, we're not here to stop projects. So what we'd like you to do is we want everything to continue moving on. We just need to understand if you have specific projects that are in certain parts of the process, they're in a screening event, or they need to go out for a screening event, or you need to process cooperating and participating agencies, or you need a class of action sign. What we'd like you to do, you've got your project delivery coordinators, who I'm going to show you on the next slide, who I know you guys met yesterday. You can work through them. You can work through myself. You can work through Javier or Victor in our office. We just need to know what's going on with your project, where are you in the process, and what do you need to accomplish. And then collectively, we'll chart you a course to get you through. We don't want anything to stop. We're here to help. We're not here to hinder. So if you've got some projects that you've got some thoughts on that you'd like to communicate, we want to make sure we get together on those projects and help those projects continue to move on even during this transition period. We talked about the project delivery coordinators and your project review teams. This slide should be very familiar to you. I bring this up because these are the same individuals that are going to be working with you within your project coordination meetings, those monthly meetings, those during the environmental document review period, as you went through that process yesterday. These are the exact same individuals that are going to be performing all the actions on behalf of OEM for your projects in that area. So just as everything else, they're a primary contact throughout. If you have any comments, questions, engage them, they'll engage us, or engage us and we'll engage them. Either way. So let's talk about some of those changes, and I go at it at a high level, and then we'll dive just a little bit deeper. The one change, and I said 95% remains the same. This is the one change, and we feel like it's a really good change. And this is an opportunity for us as transportation partners, putting projects out. They're going out to the public, they're going out to our ETAT, and we really want to make sure that collectively, we're really putting our best foot forward. You only have one opportunity to make a first impression. And so we want to make sure we're making the best impression that we can. And so that being said, we've created this pre-screening review. You got some details about it yesterday. It really is the only thing that's new and different. Everything else, I think the changes are minimal, or they're the same as they were previously. This is a pre-screening. It's a draft review. It's a draft review of the preliminary environmental discussions. And for those unfamiliar with this, the preliminary environmental discussions, as a project goes out for review and is shared with the public and the ETAT agencies, our district and our transportation partners look at each of those environmental considerations, and then they think about that project and that alternative and where it physically exists, in space, where the geometry physically resides, and they think about that particular issue, and then they identify all the things that they may come in contact with, and then what that means, and then how we're going to address it. So for instance, if they've got a proposed alternative and it looks like it's coming in contact with some historical and archaeological resources, under the historical and archaeological resource issue, they would create a PED, a preliminary environmental discussion, where they would identify those resources, and then they would identify how they were going to address those resources. And it's the same for everything else, whether we're talking about wildlife and habitat, whether we're talking about social cultural effects, whether we're talking about infrastructure or noise or anything else. There's a corresponding preliminary environmental discussion that's created relative to a particular project or alternative that the resource agencies and the public have access to, so they can see that we've done some initial assessment, and here's a fact-based what we found and what we think we're going to do, and that provides an opportunity to the ETAT members that are reviewing things to see that we know what we're talking about, and they can either confirm our understanding, or they can supplement it with some additional things that maybe we missed or hadn't considered, or anything else that they need to communicate for us. And so those preliminary environmental discussions are generated, and that will be part of the pre-screening review. That happens today. Every screening event that actively goes out today, and has been for years, every project, every alternative has a preliminary environmental discussion. So that's not new work. The new work is the review of that in a pre-screening review. The two other pieces, which are really important as well, is looking at the purpose and need and that project description. Again, this is our initial here's our project to the world. We want to make sure that we're really all collectively putting our best foot forward. And so in this pre-screening review, it's a 14-day review that happens in a draft environment before a project goes out for review. And the OEM staff would receive an email notification. They'd have access to these 3 items. They have comment boxes, and then they have the ability to say, hey, you're good to go. Here's some changes, good to go, or hey, we probably need to regroup on this before it goes out. But ultimately, this is the only change for something new. Now, I talked about this before, and those of you that are familiar with the ETDM process and the screening event and things like that, this is, we think, a very welcome change. Unlike FHWA, OEM will not be an active commenter on every single issue, on every single project that goes through every single, federal screening event. Instead, we think we accomplish those activities, that early on coordination before the project actively goes out for a review during that pre-screening review, but we will not be reviewing all of the various issues at the same time as all of the other ETAT agencies. We're going to leave that to the ETAT. They have the expertise. We've already provided our upfront analysis in those preliminary environmental discussions. We've given them a good purpose and need. We've given them a good project description. Now it's their opportunity to respond to what we've all collectively put out there. So we won't be actively doing that. Now this is where things happen exactly how you do them today, but instead of them going over to FHWA, they go over to OEM. So through the screening events, there's a review and acceptance and approval of a purpose and need. There's a review and approval of a methodology memorandum or the ACER document. There are activities where the lead federal agency needs to send out the participating and cooperating agency request invitations. There are approvals of an eliminated alternative or a class of action. All of those things are actively being done in all the screening events on the projects today. And just instead of the email going to FHWA, the email comes here. Other than that, it doesn't change at all. The last one you see on the bottom is we have to have a formal adoption of planning products. We talk about that linkage of planning to environment, and in order to pull forward some planning decisions and planning products and have them accessible so that we don't have to revisit those analyses, we can take those decisions and those efforts and support our environmental work in the development of the NEPA study. There's a formal adoption of a planning product. And really, for those that are familiar with how the environmental screening tool works and how these approvals work, it's all electronic. It's an email. It's a request for formal adoption, and then it's an act on our part of saying, yes, we adopt those products. And it's just documenting that exchange. Okay. So I think with that, we're going to just quickly do another poll. Ruth, can we turn it over to you real quick?
Yep, here's the poll. FHWA approvals will now occur by OEM under the NEPA assignment. True or false? And share the results. 92% said true and 8% said false. Under NEPA assignment, it is true that FHWA approvals will occur by OEM. During the transition, they still occur by FHWA, but we're minimizing that, and moving forward, the approvals will be done by OEM. Back to you, Pete.
Great. Thanks, Ruth. Okay. So a little more details on the pre-screening coordination and review. So we talk about that pre-screening review. It doesn't matter if it's a planning screen or a programming screen. There's some activities, and the pre-screening review is part of it. But traditional pre-screening activity, you identify your projects, you identify your federal involvement, you develop a schedule, then you develop that project information. That project information are things like the purpose and need, the project description, planning information, all the financial information, all those things that go into the development of information that will be shared through these screening events and accessible by the ETAT and the public and everybody else. It's the development of those preliminary environmental discussions where we do that initial assessment for things, and these activities are the same whether we're going through a planning screen or a programming screen. And so that's an important point, is that pre-screening review will always do that. As you're developing the projects for screening, you're engaging, you're identifying, where are these projects coming from. There's lots of different sources. They can be coming from the MPOs. They can be coming from your SWAT planning meetings, that statewide acceleration transformation team meetings, where you're getting together with those interdisciplinary folks trying to identify what are the projects that should go through these various screening events that make the most sense. Your folks are working to gather and input all of those details into the project description and those preliminary environmental discussions. And ultimately, after all this information is gathered and the information is populated and put into the environmental screening tool, you're looking and coordinating your schedules, and you're completing your internal quality assurance and quality control of the information. So this is sort of important, and I'll show you a slide in a moment that shows the stair-step progression. But in the environmental screening tool, there's a stop. It's called ETDM QA/QC, and that's the stop where the environmental administrator, the ETDM coordinator, the environmental manager, the project manager, the technical staff should be reviewing all the materials just to verify that it's up to snuff, that the purpose and need looks good, the PEDs look accurate, that it's ready to go. And then the next step before it goes out for ETAT review is it will go through that OEM pre-screening review. And so when you're ready, you basically will change a status on the project. It'll say OEM review, and when you do that, it'll automatically send an email to the OEM team that kicks off the 14-day pre-screening review. Now, one additional piece of information to talk about this pre-screening review. there are a couple things really. The 14 days is really an up to 14 days for those that work within the environmental screening tool and have other reviews or approvals that are processed. As soon as that approval or a review is processed, that's the end of the review. So for instance, if you send up the project information to complete an OEM review and they submit their response back to you on day 7, then it's over on day 7. It's not like it's open and accessible up until the 14 days. That's really up until 14 days, but it can be over whenever they submit their response. The other thing that's really important about this review is that it's happening while the project is in a draft status. The project has not left. It has not been shared externally with the department, with the ETAP members and the public. So these reviews, when they occur, OEM will have a form that allows them to see each of those components, and those components again are the purpose and need, the project description, and those preliminary environmental discussions. They'll have a form that allows them to put in some comments, and then they can, basically they have 3 choices when it sends it back to you. Hey, everything's good, go ahead. Hey, make these slight revisions and you're good to go screen. Or, we kind of need to regroup and discuss this and relook at it because there's a little more work here that needs to be completed. But when any of those 3 happen, it sends an email notification back to the ETDM coordinator and project manager if assigned. And then from there, you can make those changes. And if you're approved to move forward, you go ahead and move forward. Now, that review in and of itself, those comments that are coming in from OEM and those adjustments, again, are all happening in a draft environment. So those comments aren't going to end up in a summary report. They're not published. They're not accessible. It's 2 transportation partners trying to put the best foot forward so that when that project goes out, it's really, looking good, and we feel confident about that purpose and need and that project description. And we've done some analysis to kind of lead to really good actionable comments from our ETAT. And all of those other interactions, those reports are only accessible to the OEM staff, and they're only accessible to the district staff as well. So just an overview of what the project status page looks like. It's like I said, on the ETDM QA/QC. For those that have dealt with the environmental screening tool, there's simply a status that says OEM Review. You change the status on that project to OEM Review, it launches an email. When it launches an email, the OEM staff up here will then log on to the environmental screening tool. They'll be looking at their projects needing review, and now there's a tab in here of projects that are performing a pre-screening review, and then access to be able to look at that project and begin the review. So what are we telling the OEM staff when they're doing their pre-screening review? Because we feel like that's also an important action to communicate to you guys. What are the types of things we're communicating to them? So during the OEM pre-screening review, we ask folks to become familiar with the project. We ask them to coordinate, look at the data and the maps, make sure that they understand when they're looking at things, if they need to talk to any subject matter experts about potential resource issues, they'll do that as well. You've already got them actively engaged. They're participating in the meetings. They know about the projects that are coming on. They should be already very familiar with what's coming on. That by the time you send out a project through this pre-screening review, they should already know. They should already know what's happening with the project. So and then the final thing they're looking at and providing comments. Those 3 things again, that project description, the purpose and need, and those preliminary environmental discussions are what they're going to be actively reviewing. And I think it's important for you guys to know the types of things that we're telling them to make sure that when they're reviewing and what are the considerations. So if we think about the purpose and need, we tell them while they're looking at things, make sure we're not giving a solution. We really need to be defining the transportation problem. When you're looking at it, the data really should support the problem statement. It really should set the stage for the consideration of alternatives. You shouldn't be looking at the purpose itself, and it should not be reverse engineering the solution. When we're reviewing the purpose and need, we tell them to be looking at the need itself. It should have the rationale for why we're going after the action. It should also be facts-based, objective. It should really be specific to the transportation problem, and it should have a summary of the data and analysis. Depending on what the need is for the project, there should be it should be justified by some quantifiable data. If you're saying this is a safety issue, crash rates, things like that are very important. Another thing that we've been discussing for quite some time that folks are looking at is we want to make sure that we're really thinking about the uniqueness of the project that's going out. Not all elements are applicable to every project. So what are the elements that are relevant to this project, and how are we providing details to support that? When they're reviewing the purpose and need, we want to make sure that we're understandable to the public, that that we only do the things that are applicable, that we discuss how the alternatives solve the issue as well. Other things we're telling our folks to make sure they're looking at is, we want to be concise. The need should be, ideally less than a couple pages. The purpose no more than 1 or 2 paragraphs. We want to focus on our objectives. Again, the purpose should reflect the reasons the project is being considered, and the need describe the problem that we're addressing by the project. If we shift over to the PEDs, those preliminary environmental discussions, these things are reused in our advanced notification packages, which are shared to a much larger audience beyond the environmental technical advisory team. It can go to a much broader base, to a lot of folks in the public, politicians, things like that. So we want to make sure that our PEDs, that it indicates our understanding of the potential environmental issues and how we're going to address things. As we talk about various involvement with the resources, how much involvement are we expecting? It's really our opportunity for the department to convey what we know. We need to be specific about this particular project, this alternative, and this particular issue. What we don't want to be doing is the environmental screening tool has over 550 different data sets in there. We run analysis on those data sets, and then that analysis is available within the environmental screening tool. What we don't want to see is just a data dump of here's the analysis of all the things that we came in contact with. We want to know what's out there. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to address it? We want to communicate that type of information. We want to make sure that if we're going to come in contact with something, or even better yet, if there's something out there that we know we're not going to come in contact with, that an agency might focus on. For instance, perhaps there's a historic district that is just outside the project footprint. We can acknowledge that it's there, but that we're not anticipating to come in contact with that. That shows the State Historic Preservation Office that we've identified it, we recognize it, and that here's what we're going to do instead. We should be talking about our coordination requirements. We should be identifying technical studies if we know that, just based on the project specifics, that there are certain studies we know we're going to need to complete. If we know there are certain permits we're going to need to get, it makes a lot of sense to go ahead and just identify those up front and communicate that to our partners. All these things should be facts-based. We're sharing information. We're not indicating a finding. We need to communicate what we know. And again, that focus on, what are the potential effects, and we want to make sure we identify how we intend to address or evaluate them as the project progresses. communicate what is known, what is out there that we're aware of. And with all of that, then that should give our reviewing agencies a better context, which allow them to provide us comments that have some meaning. They can confirm what we've already provided, or they can continue to refine our understanding with additional things that either we weren't aware of, or things that as an agency they want to make sure that they communicate. We want to, ultimately we want to get their response to our impression. So with all that, the OEM reviewers have this form, and it's zoomed out pretty far, but it allows, you can see in that top box, it's looking at project description, it's looking at purpose and need, it's looking at PEDs, and then they're submitting a response. We're going to zoom in on each of those. So within this individual tool, so assume they got an email, they've logged on, they've clicked on the link that says projects needing review. There would be a listing of the project description. Then they can either say comments, yes or no. If they say yes, then there's an opportunity to put comments in there. Same thing with the purpose and need. They review that. Do have comments, yes or no? If the answer is yes, they put the comments in there. And it's the same thing with the preliminary environmental discussions. And at the end, it comes down to those three choices. Approve to screen with revisions as noted, or let's revise and resubmit. And really we should be having a conversation at that point. Assume you got an approved to screen or approved to screen with revisions as noted. Once that's submitted, it automatically updates the OEM has approved the screening, and the next jump is to send it out for ETAT review. As I said, there's a report that gets generated. Again, it's a draft report. It doesn't go anywhere else. It's not in a summary report. It's accessible by the OEM team here. It's accessible by the district staff who have the right roles and responsibilities to be able to see it. But that's the only location for it. With that, Ruth, I'm going to quickly turn it over to you for another survey.
Which items will OEM be reviewing during a pre-screening review? Please select the one that you feel best and most completely answers that question. Closing the poll and sharing the results. 81% said project description, purpose and need, and PEDs. That's the correct answer. The other answer, purpose and need and PEDs, was just incomplete. It's missing the project description item. 7% said PEDs and planning consistency. That one's incorrect just because OEM will not be reviewing the planning consistency. The three items that they will be reviewing are project description, purpose and need, and PEDs. Thanks. Back to you, Pete.
Great. Thanks, Ruth. These next three sections go a lot quicker, and the reason they go a lot quicker is because they're really how you do things today. They're just shifting over to OEM instead of FHWA as they were previously. So planning screen, we talked about it before. This is a critical flaw analysis. We're informing a cost feasible plan, helping folks prioritize whether a project should move forward. Part of that is, just as the districts do today, they prepare the project, they send it out for that pre-screening, and now the notice goes out to the ETAT. When they send the notice out to the ETAT itself, the OEM staff will, during the active planning screen review, they'll memorialize their understanding of the purpose and need. We're simply documenting that we understand the purpose and need. Obviously, we've already gone through the pre-screening process, so this is kind of really a formality, but certainly an important documentation step. And so they'll actively, within that planning screen, log in and provide that indication. They'll also, you guys, the districts, will be you're monitoring comments, you're coordinating and preparing responses, and developing your summary report. It says and coordinate with OEM. That's not really important. You're going to develop your summary report as you normally would, just as you do today. One thing we did want to highlight, and certainly it's an opportunity for you guys, in the past there have been potential issues on some submitted comments from agencies where maybe there was inconsistency among agencies, and perhaps in the past there was some discussion that you always needed to move to the higher level, you know, degree of effect for our summary reports and stuff. What we would say is that if there are any questions that you guys have, if you're noticing any inconsistencies or you want to talk about some of the comments that you've got, engage your project delivery coordinators just so that they can help guide you on that. Certainly, we don't want things to be elevated unnecessarily, and at the same time, we wouldn't want to see things lowered unnecessarily as well. So if you've got questions, just work through the team, and we want to make sure that we do that before the summary report gets published. Once the summary report gets published, that's the record. That's what gets sent out to everybody. So certainly if there's any questions ahead of time, work through your project delivery coordinators, myself, Javier, Victor, the team up here to do that. When we talk about those OEM reviewers during the planning screen, they receive that notification, they indicate their understanding. You know, they're looking at comments, they coordinate when you guys need. They're here to provide technical assistance as needed, and obviously become familiar with the project itself. This is just a screen capture of the purpose and need. You'll notice at the planning screen, the OEM reviewer will come in and indicate that they understood or not understood. Again, you've already been through the planning screening review, so this should go very quickly. As with everything else, if there are some comments that are above a certain level, like a substantial or higher, or someone indicates not understood on a purpose and need, we all, the district's OEM staff, we all receive the same notifications. This isn't new or different. Everybody receives these today, but it's just a way for all of us to kind of stay in tune with what's coming in on the projects. For the programming screen, again, that annual screening event looking at priority projects to help us scope the project, come up with enough information to have an appropriate environmental document class of action, and a clear understanding of what we're going to do to move this project forward. OEM during that process, again, it's going to review the purpose and need. This time it's shifted to accept or not accept. Again, if you think about that pre-screening event that's already occurred, we've already reviewed the purpose and need, we've already reviewed the project description, we've already reviewed the PEDs, so now this is just within the screening event how we memorialize its acceptance. Again, access to the comments as they flow in, everybody kind of sees what folks have to say and identify any potential issues. And then you shift after the programming screen. You know, we're getting ready to kind of set the stage for the coming activities in PD&E and under NEPA, and so there are activities leading us in that direction. The district, you know, works with our team here. They identify any potential technical studies or permits. They would publish a preliminary programming screening summary report. All the activities here that are listed are all the same activities already being performed in the district. If they're moving towards a class of action determination, they're going to review the requests from our agencies for participating and cooperating agencies. They'll send those recommendations up to OEM. OEM will process those recommendations. They'll also, the district will propose the elimination of specific alternatives as applicable. And again, OEM will be sent those recommendations and act on them. The class of action, the culmination of all these activities resulting in the type of environmental document and class of action that will be completed during the NEPA stage, is proposed by the district to OEM at a point in time where that's appropriate. And then ultimately, after OEM acts on that class of action, the district publishes the final programming screening summary report. Again, all those activities already happened. The difference was instead of going to FHWA on appropriate projects, it would go to OEM instead. So talking about those approvals after the programming screen, focusing on the OEM staff, participating and cooperating agencies come from this office, as well as the approval of eliminated alternatives. There's also the class of action and the adoption of the planning products. So these are just a couple of screenshots showing the recommendations from cooperating and participating agencies during the transition. Like we said, we don't want any projects to stop. So based on the unique circumstances for your individual project, talk to your project coordinators, talk to me, and we'll make sure we get you through this transitional period. Here's the screen capture for the class of action. You'll notice it all remains the same, and you'll notice on the lead agency has now switched to Office of Environmental Management. When one is proposed, we just as happens today, instead of the email going to FHWA, the email will come to OEM. They'll have a link, they'll log on, they'll sign the class of action determination. So functionally, it all stays the same. Here are some really crazy flow charts. It's really those earlier planning and programming screenings instead turned vertically, and inside of each of them are activities related to the alternative corridor evaluation process. As we said, when you want to do a more detailed evaluation of proposed alternatives, you need to have a methodology in place. The ETAT agencies and the public and the locals all need to have an opportunity to review the proposed methodology, which would include the criteria, the data, the thresholds for evaluation and the data you're going to use to do that evaluation, and that methodology itself, which is very unique and specific to the project and where it's located and the circumstances. That methodology needs to be reviewed by all the partners, and they need to have an opportunity to say that they understand it, do not understand it, or that they have some comments for us to consider. So a methodology memorandum, whether you're in a planning screen or a programming screen, is developed. It's shared with the ETAT agencies. They have it for a 30-day review. It allows them to say understood, not understood. And after that review is completed, the lead agency, in this case it could be the Office of Environmental Management, would concur on the proposed methodology based on whatever came out of that methodology review. Then from there, the district applies that methodology against the alternatives that are existing. So if you look in timeline, we had a project, it went out for a planning screen in this case. That meant that we already completed a pre-screening, that the purpose and need, the PEDs, the project description, and whatever additional details we had about the project was shared with the ETAT. It performed a normal review of 45 days. And at the end of that, we had their comments, which help inform the development of the methodology memorandum. What were they concerned about? What did they identify? What are the things that we should consider? We developed that methodology memorandum. Then we go and apply the methodology memorandum after it's been approved. And then we summarize and refine the number of alignments based on what came out of applying the methodology. What alternatives will continue to go forward, which alternatives didn't meet the established criteria set in the approved methodology memorandum. And ultimately, we memorialize all that in an ACER document, the Alternative Corridor Evaluation Report, which becomes the justification for when we would eliminate an unreasonable alternative. And so those are products that help us eliminate, and activities eliminate, unreasonable alternatives. When you try to do that in a planning phase, traditionally you could only eliminate unreasonable alternatives if they did not meet the purpose and need. But if you want to eliminate for other factors, you have to expand your review and analysis, and you've got to have some methodology, and you've got to have some reviews and some concurrence throughout the process. So when we follow the ACE process, we've got all those things, which ultimately allow us to eliminate the unreasonable alternatives and then have those decisions stand in a planning environment and then get adopted if required, or get adopted into the NEPA process when we choose to do so, when it's appropriate. So now that you understand ACE a little bit and the MM and the ACER, so the methodology memorandum goes out to the ETAT. It also gets approved by OEM staff that used to be FHWA. Same thing with that supporting ACER document. And then when an alternative is going to be eliminated, they're using the ACER document as supporting documentation and then proposing the elimination of alternatives. Again, that's already a district activity that happens. It would traditionally go to FHWA. Instead, it'll be happening here. And these are just some screenshots of that elimination process. The ACE process is designed to comply with the conditions of 23 U.S.C. Section 168. One update that did occur during the FAST Act is that when you have a cooperating agency, they also must concur on the eliminations. So we're working to include that functionality as well, so that if there is a cooperating agency, they also have that opportunity to concur on the elimination before OEM approves that elimination. And these are just some screenshots of how that review occurs. We're setting up an event. We're sending it out for review. People have access to the documents and then the ability to input their comments. And then the last section for ETDM, advancing to PD&E. We've talked about a lot of the coordination, a lot of the products that are being produced. So all of this information, whether it's the purpose and need, the class of action, cooperating participating agencies listed, the alternatives that are coming forward, those preliminary environmental discussions that are refined based on agency comments, the elimination of unreasonable alternatives, the identification of technical studies and permits. We have community liaison coordinators that are capturing public comments, maybe from previous planning activities, performing social cultural effects evaluations, using the various techniques involved with providing those assessments and identifying community desired features. There's a whole litany of things that are captured, documented, and come forward. Working with those agency partners, we've got coordination activities that have been identified. We have recommendations for work and things that maybe can be pulled forward for subsequent phases. And we have these planning studies and the results of these screening events all available to support scope development and certainly the PD&E study. When we talk about the adoption of the planning product, so maybe we want to adopt the ACER report or the eliminated alternatives or a programming screening summary report, the information must be used within 5 years of that publication, and it must also follow all the conditions set forth in 23 U.S.C. 168. There's 10 different conditions. There's also a list at the same link that's been given to you down here at the bottom that identifies all the planning products and or planning decisions that could be adopted into the NEPA process. And again, there's a lot there. We are developing a computer-based training that will be available on the learning curve that will walk through all of this in a lot more detail. The last slide before we get to the questions is handling unresolved issues. Part of the ETDM process is it has an ETDM issue resolution process for all the agency operating agreements and funding agreements, as well as the ETDM manual. There is an ETDM issue resolution process that's been identified. It's basically an escalation process where you try to resolve the issue at the lowest level and you continue to move up until you get to a decision to either move forward, pull stuff forward, or whatever the outcome is acceptable to all the parties. OEM will be taking on those responsibilities. Previously, we were already included plus FHWA, so FHWA would not be included in these conversations. In many cases, the issues are usually resolved by technical studies that may be developed, or perhaps there's questions that need to be answered or issues that need to be addressed, and there's usually work that we can work through in order to pull activities forward and then address those issues or concerns. As we move into PD&E, the ETDM issue resolution process is left behind, and the federal process would kick in. and that's under 23 U.S.C. 139. So one quick summary. The summary of changes. So for OEM, we're looking at the addition of a 14-day pre-screening review. That review will look at project description, purpose and need, and PEDs. During an active screening, OEM will not be an active commenter. We'll simply be indicating our understanding or approval of the purpose and need during the reviews. It's that upfront pre-screening review where we're going to be actively participating. The OEM approvals that were previously completed by FHWA will transition over to this office, so things like cooperating and participating agencies, eliminated alternatives, class of action determination, approval of the methodology memorandum, and the alternative corridor evaluation report, as well as the formal adoption of any planning products. So that said, we have finished the ETDM section. Ruth, do we have any questions out there I need to answer?
Yes, there's one unanswered question. For a peer process, is the district the lead then?
So
this came up on the lead slide.
Yes, so for the peer process, the district would be the lead. If you have a specific project and a specific entity you want to talk to our office about, we can have those discussions. But traditionally, unless you're an MPO or you're the department, we would be the only lead. So planning screens can be completed by our MPOs and by our districts. Programming screens are only completed by the department in general. If you have any specific or unique conditions, we're always happy to discuss those specific and unique conditions and see what we need to work through.